I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Rob Chavez. He's an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of Oregon, where he directs the Computational Social Neuroscience Lab. Rob is an expert in the computational neuroscience of social cognition, how the brain represents the self and others. Rob, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hi, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. How did you become the scientist and neurobumpkin that you are today, Rob?
That's neurobumping. Yeah, I don't know where I came up with that other than I'm just can't help but being silly. Um, well, actually, if before we get too far into my kind of incoherent pablum, is it okay if I ask you a couple of questions? Or
Yes,
you want
ask
do you want
away.
to? Yeah. So first of all, I wanted to say, I've listened to your podcast, and I think you're a really excellent interviewer. Like you ask really thoughtful and interesting questions of your guests, and it's clear you're very learned and broadly read and all this stuff. And
Working
I
on
think
it.
that's yeah,
Thank you, Rob.
I think it's really great. But one of the things I've noticed in that when I've listened to some of your episodes is that uh, you and I actually have a lot of overlap and interest in what are seemingly kind of disparate areas, right? So
Mhm.
neuroscience, social behavior, evolutionary theory, personality, behavior genetics, all these things that maybe not everybody
Uh-huh.
puts together, but that's what jumped out at me. It's like, oh, I'm interested in a lot of that stuff too,
Okay,
even
so we've
though I
got a
don't.
lot of overlap, and maybe development is the missing key piece.
Right. That's a good one. That's a good one that maybe I don't know as much about. But my question was kind of, besides just having nice conversations with interesting people, maybe present company excluded. Um, what do you have like a goal for the podcast or like a meta goal, or is it just as simple as that? Just like talking and learning.
Yeah, I certainly like it for my own benefit, and I've learned a lot, and it gives me an opportunity to connect with a whole bunch of interesting, smart people who might not otherwise give their time to me. And then there's an audience as well who gets to listen and learn from us. And I haven't thought about this much, but because this is unfolding over time for me, I started as an undergrad. Some audience members, probably the most consistent ones, are those who know me personally. Like my mom might be the only person who's listened to every episode, but you get to see what it looks like to unfold like over your academic career from undergrad to grad student. And I don't see this stopping anytime. So I look back to some of the episodes I recorded during undergrad, and there's a little bit of cringe for me asking some dumb questions, but also cringe is a great sign of progress, right? And I'm sure eventually I'll look back on the grad student days with that same sort of cringe or seeing how much I've grown. But then also, you want to balance it where you're still asking the right introductory questions. Because just because I can engage in more technical discussions doesn't mean I should, because then you're not going to reach as wide an audience. So it's kind of like that Piaget idea of into adulthood, you have to reconnect with your inner child.
Right. Yeah. I guess part of the reason I ask is, you've had all these really interesting people on that cover a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in. And, if you think of them as, predictors in your regression model with the
Mm.
outcome being all your goals, I'm not sure if adding me to that model is going to make it any more. I'm not sure if I'm going to be a significant parameter of that model, but hopefully we can work it out.
Well, it's also a social thing, right? I mean, you and I met at a conference last year and we got to chat briefly, but not for an extended block like this.
That's right.
And these are nice connections to make. You really can get to know someone or their ideas in an hour or two deep conversation.
Yeah. Well, I derailed this a little bit.
I like
uh,
the meta conversations too. I mean, that's in line with the whole philosophical theme of this podcast.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's great. So you're asking me, what were you asking? I say you're a great question asker, and then
That was a really open-ended question,
mm,
as in, how did you become the scientist that you are? So some people respond to that like they go way back to their childhood. They're an entomologist and they're like, I always liked picking up and studying bugs. I was that one weird kid with the magnifying glass. And then for others, it didn't start till much later.
yeah. I mean, I have a few stories. I don't know how much of them are actually like informed. I think I just stumbled in here through mostly luck and just blind enthusiasm. um, but yeah, I don't know. Psychology in particular, I declared it my major when I started college. Um, but I kind of didn't know what it was. I was just like, oh yeah, dreams, right? Dream interpretation, something like
And a lot
that.
of people who do that early on, they probably assume psychology and clinical psychology are synonymous, and you don't get
Right.
exposed to the research until later.
That's right. And I was certainly one of those people. And I remember early on too, I certainly wasn't interested in the brain explicitly. I remember saying it out loud, like, I don't care about that. Biology, who cares? I'm interested in the mind and the mind over matter and all this other stuff. And it wasn't until taking classes that that really changed. So in particular, I was taking at the University of New Mexico, which is where I went to undergrad. I was really interested in social psychology, but they didn't have a social psychology area really. They had an evolutionary psychology area that did some social related things, and I got interested in that. So I was trying to get into an evolutionary psychology class, and so I had to take brain and behavior. So I was taking that with no interest in the brain really, and I happened to be taking it at the same time I was taking a like intro to philosophy class where we started talking about philosophy of mind and free
Mhm.
will and eliminativism and all of these things. And they sort of collided. And one of the things that I appreciate about college was that like I came out pretty different than where I came in, when they collided, it was just like, wow, the brain, I can't, what else is there to study? And
Mhm.
trying to wed my interests in social behavior with kind of this newfound enthusiasm for, biological mechanisms that were tied into the evolutionary stuff too, but like centering it on the brain became really intoxicating.
Was Jeffrey Miller already a professor there by the time you were undergrad?
He was, yeah. His book was one of the things that got me so enthusiastic about it, which
Me
I
too.
read back in the day. Yeah,
Uh-huh. Yeah, sophomore year, and no one talks about sexual selection, which was really shocking to me. I
yeah,
thought that I was big into evolutionary theory, but I was only thinking about things in survival terms until I read The Mating Mind.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, not everything in the mating mind has held up as much as, and he didn't propose it that way at the time. It was more just like, "Hey, here's an idea." But I
Mhm.
am still surprised by how much, especially when we're talking about traits that seem sort of like, why do we have that? That seems like, you know, doesn't seem very adaptive. I'm like, well, it might be adaptive in a different domain, and that might be one that's better seen through the lens of sexual selection instead of natural selection, or, more descent of man than origin of species.
Mhm. You mentioned that we already have a lot of overlap in interests. This is making me think we might have had even more overlap when we were both undergrads, but then
Yeah.
you got more computational over time. How did that happen?
Yeah, yeah, and maybe that's related to some of this evolutionary psychology stuff. Like over time, I still like evolutionary theory as kind of a meta theory, as a way of like kind of grounding broader psychological interests within within a construct that's outside of itself a bit, right? But over time, I sort of lost my enthusiasm, or I fell out of love with like standard evolutionary psychology framework because it became another victim of the replication crisis and these other things. Like it was
Mhm.
always billed as like this is a way that we can generate models or, generate predictions for things in the world. And some of those things just didn't hold up as well as I thought they would, or as well as I thought they were advertised. And I did a minor in statistics when I was an undergrad. And so, as computing and all these resources that were really blossoming, like in the early 2010s, late aughts. I just kind of caught the bug like a lot of other people, and then I was just like, well, this seems to do a better job. This stuff is good at predicting
Uh-huh.
mathematically. That's what it's for. But figuring out how to use it appropriately is, of course, remains a challenge, and that's kind of where I got into that more.
That's interesting to me because I also got interested in stats. I did cognitive science and then added on biostatistics. But for most psych majors, stats is the bane of their existence. And you
Right.
decided you want to do more of that. What do you
Yeah.
think led to that?
Again, it was just one of these like things I came in different than I fell out. Like I always was, a little scared of math and a little scared of coding, like computer programming kind of things. But then once I realized, oh, I want to do psychology research, I want to do cognitive neuroscience research. You need to do that. Like that's how you do it. And I was like, well, if that's what I got to do, then that's what I got to do. And then one thing leads to another, and then you're
Mhm.
down that rabbit hole again. And yeah, that's where I found myself.
Another ironic thing is I got interested in neuroscience because I realized the way that psychologists do it, at least with neuroimaging, it's not really like neurobiology. And I never was interested in biology, at least the type of wet lab stuff. And I still don't really understand cellular level mechanisms, even though I understand hormones now. But I think about it more from the behavioral perspective, like behavioral endocrinology studies.
Mm.
There's a lot of experimental animal manipulation where it's just giving them hormone injections or blockers or castration, all sorts of different manipulations. And you look at the behavior, you don't necessarily have to understand what's happening at the cellular level to the hormones, how they interact with the brain. You just have to create a theory. And then you can say if there are sex hormones that predict these sex differences in line with evolutionary theory, like I like how all of that fits together. But I still avoid the mechanistic level as much as possible. And then what I found out about neuroimaging is like, well, you get to do data science. You don't have to go into a wet lab.
Yeah, it's almost like a cheat. So I worry that I don't know. Again, I just maybe my interests are too broad for my ability to actually learn things, but I kind of see it as this nice medium step. We're not getting at sodium ion channels. We're just not, right?
Mhm,
With human fMRI anyway. We're getting at this blood flow measure, which is a proxy of, we're getting the, proxy of neural activity, we hope, but we can't really differentiate excitatory versus inhibitory or, all of these issues. But like, it depends on what you're doing too. So if you're doing diffusion MRI, um, you are picking up on properties of white matter microstructure. And when you get into it a little bit, it's like, well, why is, diffusion going parallel to the length of the axons? If there's an oligodendrocyte that gets in the way, shouldn't that reduce the FA signal? And then I'm on a whole other track of things, and I'm reading animal papers on
mhm,
oligodendrocytes when I'm supposed to be trying to apply this to social behavior in humans using self-report scales. Um,
mhm.
so it doesn't always help me in my actual like research, like practice. But theoretically, it's all. I mean, I can't help but see it all being tied together.
So coming out of undergrad with these newfound research interests and stats knowledge, what did grad school look like for you? And how
To
did
be
you
honest,
decide to apply?
yeah. I mean, I was gonna apply that once I figured out this is what you want to do. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to grad school. So that's when I switched my minor to statistics, and that's when I started looking for research opportunities. Um, During undergrad, I was working full time while in school, and then I added this volunteer job in a neuroimaging lab on top of that, which I'm glad I did because it hardened me up a bit. I don't recommend to my worst enemy because it was just a lot of work. But the good news is that lab I volunteered in eventually turned into a job that I had post undergrad for a couple of years, working with a person named Rex Young, doing studies on creativity and uh, personality and intelligence, using neuroimaging tools, which is where I got to learn where I got my intro to like cognitive neuroscience, basically working in that lab. Um, so, I was learning about diffusion imaging. I was starting to do some fMRI work and other things. So by the time I got to grad school, I remember everybody warning you like, oh, grad school is really different from undergrad. You have to work a lot. There's all these new things. I was just so ready. Like it
Mhm,
felt like just fun. Like it was just fun. Uh, I had moved across the country and there was some weirdness. I went to college in my hometown of Albuquerque. I moved to the Northeast, in the Southwest and the Northeast are about as different as you think they are, right?
mhm.
So it took some adjustment to like the climate, but to the actual work, I really felt like I hit the ground running. I was ready to get started
Where was grad school for you?
at Dartmouth.
And to do did you end up actually doing what you set out to do?
Not not particularly, but not too far off, I guess. When I started, I was really interested in kind of continuing what I was doing, which is like individual differences in personality stuff. I was interested in, um, mentalizing and in like person perception and these kind of things. And some of that stuff I still do, I guess. I was always interested in self and self-referential processing, kind of vaguely, but that's what sucked me into grad school a lot. And that's what I think I'm more known for or or more central to my interest these days. The
That's
other stuff is still
interesting
there too, but yeah,
that you
but
frame
that
it around personality, because that's more of a cognitive process, the way that I've been taught it, at least. It's like this is something that everyone does, and there's less focus on individual differences.
yeah, my trajectory in was the reverse of that, which I've since learned is less common, but I didn't know that at the time. And I think it was just a function of the labs I had been working in.
Uh-huh. Do you know Colin DeYoung at Minnesota?
Yeah, we collaborate. We have a couple papers together.
Uh-huh. And you're actively involved in the same personality research, personality neuroscience?
Yeah, yeah, very similar. So, yeah, Colin and I, along with one of his former students, like published a paper on basically big five correlates of um, white matter integrity in this larger sample. We were particularly interested in openness, and we had done that a few years ago. But I had met Colin just prior to starting grad school, and he's a really bright guy who thinks really deeply about these things.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so even when I was interviewing for grad school with my advisor, with my who would become my advisor, he was like, "You should check out Colin DeYoung's work." I was like,
Uh-huh.
"I know
Cool.
Colin." Yeah.
Well, personality neuroscience is in an interesting spot because one way to look at it is personality research has been around for decades and still comparatively, there's hardly any neuroscience research on it. So that's surprising. And then if you hear from its critiquers, there's like, why do you think a personality trait would be something that you can easily localize in a brain? There's all going to be these subtle individual differences of a whole bunch of things that all sum into it. And then maybe that discourages you from looking, but then it's surprising that anyone gets to do it at all. So you're in this interesting niche.
Yeah. And, it depends on what you're talking about when you're talking about personality. I think what Colin would say is it's not just the big five. Like that's one of the frameworks for, the lexical hypothesis and all these things. But any kind of relatively stable individual differences measure is a personality trait that could be thought of as a personality trait, right? Um, so, yeah, maybe it's not just one little chunk of the cortex that does it, but then, how can we start to think about ways of analyzing data that just don't assume that one little chunk of the cortex is all you need? And that's when you
Mhm.
start to get into like, more multivariate methods and these biomarker approaches. And they're challenging too, and they're not going to save the day necessarily, but I think it does give you a little bit more purchase in trying to describe how we can understand how the brain actually represents individual differences in some way or kind of, yeah, uh, I don't know what the markers are looking like. They're probably not, my amygdala volume is 3
Mhm.
millimeters more. Therefore I'm, this much more extra, I don't know, neurotic or something like that.
Mhm.
It's probably more, uh, distributed than that, but then it becomes much harder to interpret, right? So the broader the trait, the broader, you'd expect the distribution in the brain and in the genome to be,
Uh-huh.
maybe.
Right, just like the behavioral genetics where you have these
Yep.
polygenetic things, and then people might be taking thousands of genes and doing some sort of like principal components analysis. Is that how the machine learning starts to come into your work?
Eh, yeah, and not too different. And in, behavior genetics is, um, you know, has a lot of similarities to what we do in neuroimaging, more broadly, right? So they have lots of little genes, those, little alleles and all these other genetic markers, that may individually not do too much, but in the aggregate, can you might be able to predict things better. I think neuroscience is starting to take that turn too. Sometimes it's with principal components analyses, but sometimes it's just with, uh, I don't know, things like regularized regression. So rather than, looking at every voxel univariately, here, then here, then here, we use all the voxel information in concert. Then we just use some shrinkage methods to like reduce down the ones that aren't very informative. And then we're left with a model that we can then apply out of sample to a different data set to see how well it works. Um, I think, we're still developing those methods to see if they can be actually useful. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Um, but it's not always clear when they're not what the issue is. Is it just lack of data, not having enough data? That's a real possibility. Is it that the phenotypes we're interested in, these questionnaire measures, are not good models of the brain, even if they're useful at that level of analysis? That's possible. Um, but I still think, like you say, there's not a ton of people doing personality. There's plenty of people doing individual differences in this or that, but doing a really thorough personality neuroscience perspective, there's really only a handful of people in the world that I know of.
That's a cool club you get to be part of.
I hope so.
The other thing that's surprising to me about this type of data, especially when you're talking about diffusion and white matter microstructure, it's not obvious to me what the story is, even if you find an effect. Like if you see something like in fMRI, greater amygdala activation, looking at scary faces compared to neutral faces, that's there's kind of a story there. And I've never been able to really understand these subtle structural differences and how you link it to psychological variables.
Yeah. So the analogy I like to use is like, so when you get bored and you turn on Netflix, right? So you want to have a nice streaming experience of Netflix in order to reduce your boredom, right? To have that happen, you need like a laptop that's working, right? Because you need to be able to watch it. And you need to have Netflix servers that are working because they need to be able to deliver you content. When you're trying to watch Netflix and it's not going well, it's being janky it's usually not because of your laptop or because of the servers. It's because of your crappy Wi-Fi signal, right? Um, so it's not about the process, the things that are doing the computing, or like the gray matter regions that are actually processing the information. It's a problem with how they're communicating, right? If you're trying to do it over,
Mhm.
a high speed internet connection, great, like it shouldn't be an issue. But trying to do the same thing over one with less fidelity, or a dial-up modem, right, is going to be much more difficult. And even if the two things at the end are just as capable of doing what they're doing, right, and that speaks to this, more broadly, this kind of idea of emergence, like what watching Netflix is. Now my metaphor is breaking down a little bit, but is a little bit of like an emergent property of all of these things together. You can't watch Netflix without all of these things in place, or you can't have an
Mhm.
experience of Stranger Things with all these things in place. And I kind of think of the brain, um, some aspects of brain structure and function in the same way.
That's making me think of neuropsychology lesion studies where it's not actually a brain area that's damaged, but it's those white matter pathways that connect two areas. So you lose function, not because area A or B is damaged, but just A or B can't communicate with each other.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So then,
And
go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I imagine there's two ways you could apply computational neuroscience to that. One would be just you're doing neuroimaging and dealing with these big data, and you're looking to find new techniques to analyze that in the way you want to, like what you mentioned. And then another would be if it's like full on artificial intelligence. There are some of these studies where you can lesion nodes in an artificial neural network, and it's analogous to if you're lesioning a real brain, and the same functions tend to cluster together.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't done any work like that, but I always think those methods are really interesting. Yeah. These kind of, uh, yeah, artificial lesions to networks to see how it rearranges the network properties a little bit.
Mhm.
So, I think what they usually do for that though, well, I don't know. But I thought what they did for the lesion things was eliminate nodes, which, will change, the connections to the other nodes. But if they
Hmm.
were to lesion edges, the connections, instead of the nodes, I don't know if that would make a difference or not, or if there's really a theory of what does it mean to have a network with a node that isn't connected to the network. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I don't know if we have a good
Right.
well, maybe
I
some
don't know
sense,
enough
but
about how they work. I don't even know if
yeah.
there are connections which are separate things to lesion, but I could imagine an intermediate, like hidden layer that could be lesion as if it were a connection.
Yeah, and, and once you really start to get down into it too, this is where I start to get out of my element a bit. But I remember I went to a talk by Earl Miller, who's a primate neurophysiologist at MIT. Um, and he does things in decision making. He studies, frontal cortex function in monkeys or in monkeys, I believe. And he was giving a talk about oscillations and how oscillations drive um, basically the formation of ensembles, of neural ensembles in certain regions or whatever. And, so I'm listening to the talk. I'm sort of getting it. I don't know. This is still in grad school. Um, and I asked him, it dawned on me, it's like, okay, if it's just about these oscillations, right? Do you need to have, a structural connection from this neuron to that neuron for it to participate in an ensemble or not? Or does it just have to be tuned to whatever frequency that ensemble cares about? And he was like, well, the like the actual neuroanatomist in the room would hate that I said this, but we don't know, like, or it's not clear what that means. And if it's not a direct connection that does it, that's necessary. That really starts to unravel our understanding about a lot of these things. But that's when everything starts to get away from me a bit. It's like, well, then what do we know kind of stuff.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it's again, you tug on one part of the blanket, it pulls the whole thing. So
Those frequency theories of consciousness have never made sense to me, like the Coke and Crick, what you hear about in intro neuroscience classes. And maybe it's because I came from more of a cognitive science background, so I'm thinking about neural networks in terms of this computational model, like each neuron is signaling to the other, and it's more like a binary thing. Or once you have networks, it's still about achieving a threshold of activation. In that framework, oscillations or doesn't really come into it at all. So maybe that's why it's hard for me to connect to it.
yeah, and I think it's a nice reminder to be kind of humble about, our over theorizing from the kind of really, I don't know, we have from the really impoverished set of data we have thus far. I mean, if you look around at what neuroscience is doing, it's incredible. But, compared to what we need, what we know compared to what we need to know is still really, really small. And that's why, I get really skeptical, especially in theories of consciousness. All of my work hits the consciousness wall really quickly. But it's not that I'm not interested in consciousness. It's just so clearly not a problem I can solve or not even solve. Like I feel like I can make progress on only because we're still like searching around in the dark a bit. We're still mapping the sky, much less trying to find out the orbits of the planets or come up with a grand theory of, physics.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's where we're still at. So I think it's okay to have those ideas and talk about them, and hopefully that can be generative in making interesting theories and testing ideas. Um, but it still feels like early days to me.
There's definitely some connection between like theory of mind, mentalizing and introspecting about yourself and
Mhm.
consciousness. And I want to pivot to talking about artificial intelligence and philosophize a bit about consciousness and how it could be mimicked because, you know, things like ChatGPT are pretty good at inferring answers to like theory of mind type questions, but then there's plenty of examples of where they get tripped up and it shows that they're really just predicting like what is a reasonable sounding answer here without truly understanding. But usually, especially if it's an example that gets really publicized, they get patched pretty quickly. And you could imagine in the not so distant future an AI that could pass any Turing type test without true conscious theory of mind, but it's like too good to fool us in any obscure counterexample. And then it's like, well, how can you prove what it's really doing?
Right. Yeah. And that's where it gets hard. And this is where, again, I feel like I can't make a lot of, there's not a lot of room for me to get traction there. Maybe I'm just not as clever as other people, but yeah. How do you discern a seemingly conscious machine from an unconscious machine if its outputs are perfect, right?
Mhm.
Or are human, are perfectly human-like, right? Or fit within all the distributions on all the metrics we would expect. Um, and then I forget who the philosophers were that like talk about these things, but people have made some similar arguments about other individuals. Like, how do you know
Right.
people walking around are conscious or not? Like, I think I'm conscious. Let's say I am. So I assume everybody else who's a walking being is as well. But, some people pointed out maybe it's possible that some people aren't actually conscious, like, and we don't have a
Right.
way of really proving that. And I don't see that problem being that much different than a really sophisticated artificial intelligence system. Um, but it's still hard for me to imagine that it has the 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 qualia that I do. And that
Mhm.
seems like a differentiator to me. But
That's
again,
that's
yeah,
exactly where I was gonna take this. You can imagine a system which can seemingly pass the test, but there's just this intuitive judgment of, but it's just faking the
yeah,
test. It doesn't have the same stuff as we do, but you can't really prove other humans have it. I mean, you can like put them in the fMRI scanner and find out their brains are doing roughly the same thing that you're doing, but there's still somewhat of a leap of faith that their brains aren't just doing all this mechanistically without qualia. So then you could take the opposite assumption of like, well, if this thing can do similar computations, even if it's in a radically different way, it might have qualia. Who knows?
yeah. And again, I don't think I can tell with Chat GPT anymore. I can tell it with Atom GPT. Like,
Mhm.
um, or like we don't have like a way of, we don't have like a magic, device that can differentiate the
Right.
qualia levels, right? Or
Especially if you think all sci-fi about, you know, doing some sort of deep fake that learned my voice and face off of the podcast, and then it's outputting with my voice ChatGPT written answers. Because you could just say, well, I'm looking at a human, I know I'm talking to you, but we're not even talking in person, we're talking over the screen. So there could be Adam GPT fake running this podcast for me, outsourcing.
that'd be incredible.
And then you get more time for research. That'd be good.
Maybe, yeah, if it wasn't already doing that for us too, but
Another interesting thing about this individual differences approach is it sort of implies things like theory of mind ability are traits. And I also have a little bit of an intuition against that, not to say that it's wrong, but with the exception of extreme differences like in autism, I think most people take more of a nurture approach. Like they think, your ability to mentalize or to introspect is somewhat something you practice. There's less intuitive appeal to thinking that it's just a natural, stable difference that might be genetically based.
yeah, people get wrapped up into this stuff sometimes, and I don't understand the issue. Like, if you look at, behavior genetic studies of like any kind of personality trait, the heritability estimates are, depending on how you measure them, usually hear like 40 to 60%, or, in some cases it's higher if it's like other people's judgments or whatever. Um, but, you know, the mistake or the common mistake people have when thinking about that is that, oh, heritability means that 80% of my capacity for mentalizing is due to my genes. And that is not what heritability means, right?
Mhm.
Heritability is 80% of the variance in the population is due to blah, right? Is due to this. It's not about you. It's a population level descriptor. Um, and, so, lots of people can have, uh, one way that I kind of dissociate it for myself when I'm trying to think of a problem is like, am I doing a differences among people idea, or am I doing something through more of a cognitive lens, right? which is what I've gravitated to more over the years. Like, what are the cognitive processes that need to be in place that describe a mentalizing procedure? That's one question. On top of that, you can say, okay, there's some cognitive processes that lead to this mentalizing thing. Um, Now we can ask about, are there differences in that mentalizing thing, right? And there certainly will be. Some of it will just be noise, measurement error, whatever. But maybe some other parts of it are different, right? So one assumption you can make is that it's all the same machine. They're going, predicting some, or, these cognitive systems are making some mentalizing ability. Um, and then there's differences in that. And then you can relate those to brain function or structure or whatever you want. Another thing, though, possibility is that there's a different suite of cognitive abilities that are actually informing the individual differences variables. Um, and that's much harder to do. And I don't think people have thought about it quite as deeply, myself included. But that's a process. But whether or not like it's hard, like, unlearnable or hardwired, like it's clearly both, as I'm, as you're well
Mhm.
aware. The question is where and when, and, uh, under what conditions is it, just kind of anchored to what you were predisposed to versus really changeable. And I think a lot of researchers I run into have way too extreme opinions on this on both sides. Some people just think, well, of course, if you just put people in the right context, they'll learn it as well as anybody else. And that seems
Mhm.
wrong to me. And, the other side is like people are born with it. There's nothing that seems wrong to me too. But then you're
Right.
stuck in the chewy middle where, nobody really agrees on the lines. And that may be because they don't exist
Mhm.
very clearly. Right.
The best example I've seen for the heritability is not the same as genetically caused is number of fingers that people have is almost 0% heritable because the amount of having some number of fingers other than 10 that's caused by genetic disorder is minuscule compared to just people losing fingers in freak accidents. So almost all of the variance is environmental.
That's right. And, another example that I've heard, this one is kind of, I hope I don't butcher it, but, it's kind of dark, is basically like if they took everybody who has red hair, like orange red hair, and they, at birth, they cut one of their fingers off, right? Having red hair is very high, is very genetic, right? If they did that systematically, having less fingers, that would become heritable because of
Mhm.
fewer fingers, because, you know, it would be associated with this red hair thing, but it would have nothing to do with genes. It would be entirely
Right.
environmental. But it would find its way into the heritability estimates because of, a environmental thing. And that's why these concepts are way more, aren't as simple as they seem on the face. And people who are doing serious behavior genetics work are really aware of that. But people who are less familiar with that, sometimes just dismiss it. And um, I get frustrated by that sometimes. Like, no, no, no. Like, there's so much to know.
But what does it tell you then when you do find some heritability to a personality trait, but you don't know if it's genetic or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think the heritability estimates are like step one to me. Um, if something was entirely, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. And I don't do a ton of stuff, to be honest, in, genetics or thinking about these things. But, even with everything I just said, if there's some good amount of heritability, what I assume is there's some genetic causality in there, even if that's not
Mhm.
always right. But that's kind of where my mind goes. I mean, that means, okay, there's some of these things that are anchored. Let's start there. And then, if you're interested in things like intervention or, changeable thing, then you have like a baseline of what you can expect can change, um, with certain environmental things. Um, but that won't always be right because of all the issues we just talked about. Right. Um,
I'm wondering if this is related to the idea that in the brain, a lot of things that we think are different they look very similar. So like introspection versus mentalizing about others, or thinking about the past, remembering versus imagination.
Mhm.
They're recruiting largely the same neural circuitry.
Yeah. And now we're starting to get into things that are a little bit closer to work that I actually do. And this is like, or work that I actually do, like
Mhm.
work that is done in my lab. That is like one of the more core questions to what I do is like, okay, so we've been doing this social neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience for, however many years. We've got a pretty good handle on some of the brain regions that are involved in self-referential processing, in thinking about others, mentalizing, and yeah, imagination, and recollection. And depending on which one you're talking about, it's a lot of overlapping real estate. Um, and why this is interesting to me is because then I'm like, okay, they're all happening in the same places, but what are those brain regions computing? What are they doing, right? And just because two brain regions activate for for the task doesn't mean they have the same job, right? Just because two people work at in the same building doesn't mean they're doing the same thing. Um, and I think we're just beginning to start to I don't know, address this a little bit. So let me give a concrete example from some really fresh research from my lab. So one of the things that we were interested in, we did this study using um, what's called a round robin design. So basically, what we did was we have people come in the scanner, we have them think about themselves using this task, we have them think about other people in a similar way using the task, and then we can estimate like a brain response for self versus a brain response for six other people. And now it's round robin because all of the people they're thinking about are also in the study. So,
Mhm.
so everybody's a target and a perceiver for everybody else. And why that's cool is then you can get these cool, like, you can compare my brain region's activation for me with theirs when they're thinking about me, and me when I'm thinking about them, and the combination of all their friends when they're thinking about me, and everything they're in, right?
Mhm. Is that neural
Um,
synchrony?
um, it's not really synchrony because they're not doing it in the same like time series, but you can just look to see, is your pattern for Rob similar to my pattern for Rob, right? For me,
Mhm.
and see how close those are and what that predicts. So, I don't want to get too far into the details, but basically what we found was when doing these similarity analyses, when you look to see how uh, similar I thought you were to me in terms of these warmth competence dimensions that are really popular in social psychology, the more similar I thought you were in that space to me, um, uh, and the more similar I thought things were to a bunch of people, you can model it in two different ways. You can model it in others to others differences. So we call that allocentric distance, right? And the brain seems to represent allocentric distance in a particular way. But you can also model it like egocentric distance, the differences between me and all the people in my network, and see what parts of the brain are recruited there. When you do that, you get a region of the brain that's called the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, that we know is involved in both self-representation and, more popularly, it's involved in things like mentalizing. What's interesting about that to me is like, okay, great. Like the closer we are, the more representative, or, the more similar the representation is. That's not true. We actually found the opposite, right? So what this is saying is that the more similar you are to me, part of what my dorsal medial prefrontal cortex has to do is ensure that the more similar you are, the more separate that brain region has to ensure that we are, so that presumably my representation of one another, of you and I, don't get confused, right?
Do
So,
you think this
when
connects to those econ decision-making studies where if you're choosing between products, the more similar they are, the more difficult it is?
maybe I think of it as more akin to, there's this effect in memory research. It's called the hippocampal like repulsion effect. So the more similar two objects are that you're trying to keep in the memory, more dissimilar the hippocampal representations are, because it has to
Mhm.
say those things are very similar, but yeah, they're different. It's
Mhm.
more analogous to that kind of thing. And so when we're asking what is the DMPFC recruiting for mentalizing, we think, oh, the kind of standard view maybe is the DMPFC is on, so we're mentalizing about people. When really it's like, well, no, what is it actually doing? And part of what it's doing, at least in this context, it's doing other things too, of course, is maybe this repulsion effect, which sounds bad in the context of people, but like,
Mhm.
um, and yeah. So, trying to figure out what overlap in cortical real estate, or however you want to think about it, means, will require a little bit more. I don't know. We're still unpacking that a little bit, but it's important, right? So, like, my daughter is half me, right? I love her more than anything in the world. I don't confuse my self states with her states, right?
Mhm.
um, I just don't. And if I did, I'd probably have neurological or psychiatric issues. Um, so, something in my brain is computing that difference, despite the fact that she's my kin and that she is me, at some level. Um, my brain is like computing that thing. And when psychologists use these metaphorical, like, shortcuts for understanding, sometimes this stuff gets conflated. So, for example, there's this inclusion of self and other scale. It's these like circles that, just, if you're
Mhm.
kind of similar, they somewhat overlap. If you're really similar, they really overlap. Um, and that's a perfectly fine measure, whatever. You're trying to see like how similar or how much you have in common with other people. But when people take it too literally, like, oh, they're included in myself, it's like, what does that mean mechanistically? And I just think it's maybe useful as a behavioral measure, but not have a really coherent biological underpinning in the same way. So thinking about it through that metaphor actually confuses the the account of it at the lower level of analysis, and I'm really interested in that struggle in my research.
Are we thinking about this purely cognitively in terms of representation, or does it also influence empathy and behavior?
I was thinking about it just cognitively, but presumably it does affect those things as well. There's plenty of evidence to show that people who engage their dorsal medial prefrontal cortex more, um, are, engage in more empathetic behavior in individual differences like fashion. Um, but, even so, it's like, okay, they're engaging it more. What is it doing? What part of it, given that we know it does different things, what is being engaged that is actually predictive of that? Uh, which tool is it using? And that is less clear.
This is making the hormone hammer come out because I'm thinking of all those studies about oxytocin influencing empathy and making people feel closer to others or expand the whatever size of your group bubble is who you consider in group. And if that could be mediated by this sort of representation or related at all.
Yeah, yeah, it's totally possible. Yeah, I'm not as, savvy about the hormone stuff and how they relate to these things, but like I know people who do plenty of work on this stuff, and I'd be curious to hear what they said about it. I don't know of any work off the top of my head that is looking at hormone level influences on representations, neural representations as we define them in social neuroscience, which tend to be these, fMRI pattern analysis things.
Mhm.
Um, but that seems like low hanging fruit. Somebody should do that.
I think people are doing it with empathy, but that's sort of like behavior first, representation after, rather
Mm,
than other way around. And then there would also be an interesting connection to animal research there. I mean, you could test those things more experimentally in animals. But then I'm also thinking about how we definitely know animals can mentalize, at least other primates. And people are still more iffy about introspection. But if they're the same neural process, that just seems like clear cut solved. Why don't we say animals are as introspective as long as we know that they can have theory of mind?
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And it's hard too. So going back to, using, evolution as sort of like a meta theory, maybe this isn't a correct way to think about it, but I do it sometimes. And like being aware of other animals and, in kind of birds is really important. Being socially aware becomes, important in a bunch of different species, right? So presumably the social perception and the social attunement um, is pretty old, phylogenetically speaking. Once you start to get to introspection and self-reference and everything, there's it's harder to find clear-cut evidence of human level self-representation in that. And, maybe it's because we don't have good tools for looking for it. There's some evidence, the mirror test and in elephants and in bonobos and chimps, right? Some evidence for that. And it makes me wonder too, at what point does the animal work in that domain stop being as, when thinking about self and others, stop being as useful because they don't have a human frontal pole, right? Which is where part of where we know self-representation happens among other places. Um, Part of what that thing is computing is something about self-representation. And if animals don't have like a, you know, homologous or analogous like part of the brain, it's difficult, I think, to make some of those comparisons. But that helps me keep a little grounded in the evolutionary thinking, the armchair evolutionary thinking
Hmm.
too. Is like, well, self and introspection, especially when it comes to more complex issues like values, beliefs, and all these other things, might not have as clear of a pathway to using the animal work to inform it. Um, that's overstating it a little bit. Animal work is really important, and we think about this stuff a lot, um, but it's not clear to me that where the line is of when it's super informative and when it's not not as much so.
You asked at the very beginning what I get out of this podcast, and that made me think of another one, which is just getting to make these crazy interdisciplinary connections and
Hmm.
spitball ideas. So then when you mentioned birds, I was thinking of this phenomena of sexual imprinting that I learned about recently. So there's the classic imprinting, like Conrad Lorenz studies in ducks and in geese. They just imprint on the first thing they see that moves after hatching, and they'll follow them along like it's a mother, even if it's a human or anything else. But some birds sexually imprint. So this is specifically in those that are sexually dimorphic, and it's usually the male that looks really identifiable and has like fancy colors. And females, maybe genetically, innately, can identify that and they'll be more attracted to the brighter colored ones. But a lot of female birds across species are kind of gray and drab and they look similar. And even the males can't tell them apart. So, with the sexual imprinting, what researchers found is some males, upon sexual maturity, they'll sexually imprint on the first mature female they see, even if it's a bird of another species. And then, even if you reintroduce the right species to them, they won't mate with them. They just imprint and then, so they're genetically out of luck because they won't be able to mate. The ones they imprinted on are the wrong species, and the ones that they can mate with, they just
Right.
they won't be attracted to them.
Yeah, that seems like a fast track for ending your genetic lineage, right? Where it doesn't
Mhm.
seem super adaptive for the individual, but maybe in the aggregate, um, having and I don't know anything about this research. I'm just spitballing here, but like maybe having an adaptation to if you're usually around your species of bird and you're a male
Right.
bird. Um, Maybe that's a really effective strategy, and yes, it fails sometimes when you happen to be not around that group of birds, uh, but, uh, but as a whole, as a species at the species level, it is adaptive even if it's not particularly for given member of
Right,
the
and
species.
computationally way simpler because it's basically just this heuristic based on well, seeing anything remotely bird-like, you don't have to encode all those specific details.
Yeah, you can have a bird level brain. You don't need to, you don't need to think in probability distributions at the population level. You could just, yep, go, right?
Huh. Is there any other ongoing research you want to talk about, Rob?
I, yeah, we have all kinds of stuff going on sometimes. Like, some people are dabbling in like AI level things. One of the things I've been curious about, I mean, most of the stuff I do, I try to keep in the neuroscience realm. Um, but we are trying to think about like, how can we make that use, like make these advances in like AI useful? I'm not an AI hype person. In fact, I'm kind of skeptical sometimes. But one thing that I think we could do, getting back to the personality neuroscience stuff, which I haven't figured out exactly how to do yet, is, imagine they have like this big data set. I don't know, like the ABCD data set that I'm sure you're familiar with, right?
Hmm.
Um, and let's say they have a few scales in there, but they don't have a scale that, you're interested in, right? They developed this new one. They couldn't put it in there. Obviously, it's already been collected, but you're interested in what that scale can do for, if it has some brain correlate, right? One of the things that we're starting to think of now is if we can use things like ChatGPT or any sort of large language model to take essentially the word similarity from one scale, to try and predict, to try and take, responses from that scale and transform it into the responses from another one using only the words. So not having like a model based on the responses, but using only word and semantic level similarity, can we essentially impute your scores on a different scale that you didn't collect? And this is way more difficult than it sounds, it turns out. Uh, yeah, so maybe I'm giving away an idea that somebody else can steal. That's fine. Um, but like figuring out how to do that would be really powerful. What you'd get from that is not a perfect, measure of whatever it is that you're trying to get from the new scale, but it'd be so much more like economically efficient than going out and
Hmm.
collecting a whole new ABCD data, ABCD data set, to see like, is there hints of some relationship with this new thing there, based on this model of, this kind of scale imputation thing that I'm talking about. And if you can do it in a sample like ABCD or Biobank or any of these big sample things, and you find something, then you can be like, okay, now we have justification for doing the real study where we actually measure the measure, instead of having this proxy thing for it. And I think that's
Hmm.
maybe, it might not work. In fact, I'll be surprised if it works super well, but that's something I've been thinking about a lot as a way to get away from, these small sample, even like a few hundred people we know is hard for neuroimaging, brain-wide association studies kind of things. And maybe this is a way to expand that a little bit, for cheap. Um,
Hmm.
but we'll see if it works.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's always the trade-off between the most novel questions you can ask. You have to collect new samples or even design a new measure, and it's probably going to be small and tedious, and you have to worry about statistical power. And then the giant studies pretty much only let you have the most well-established, like NIH toolbox measures that everyone uses, but then you don't really get to ask new questions.
Right. And if there's like a way to transform measures from that through the language models to measures of something else, even something novel, that would be incredible.
Hmm. Cool. That's a great place to wrap up. Thank you for your time, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. This has been fun.